Hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Charts with Dan. We've got a lot to get to today, including the debut of Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. Was it a good debut? Was it a bad debut? Was it one of those cases where it's in the middle? We have a lot of different numbers to look at, as well as the continued and surprising success of Sound of Freedom. Before we get to that, though, I want to take a moment to address the fact that we are doing shows here as the writers and actors are on strike. And I did a video last week breaking down the SAG-AFTRA strike, if you want to check that out, kind of the mechanics behind it, and then some of my own thoughts. And in the days since, there has been a discussion that I've seen online about people like me on the internet who do movie news and review movies for a living, and whether us doing what we're doing constitutes promotion or publicity of the movies themselves. Some people have said very openly that reviewing a movie during the strike is tantamount to scabbing or taking the job of a striking worker, in this case, an actor who's barred from doing promotion for movies. And I have to say that I disagree with that viewpoint wholeheartedly, mainly because film criticism to me is not meant to be something that promotes a movie. Now, the one thing that is banned explicitly by SAG-AFTRA is paid promotional advertisements for movies, and that's something that I don't do. I don't take studio money to talk about a movie or make a video about a film, and even if I did, I wouldn't during the strike. But yes, I am going to continue to review movies here on the channel, and I'm going to continue to cover box office and cover the news, because that's what I do. And by SAG-AFTRA's own definition, that is not in violation of a strike. There was a Q&A that was published in Variety actually earlier today about frequently asked questions about a strike, and it said, if I'm a film critic, can I still review movies? And it specifically said, yes, film criticism is not covered under striking activities. I don't see the moral quandary that some see. And again, it's mainly because I just don't consider film criticism and promotion to be the same thing. Now, having said that, I have seen time and time again when people ask striking writers and actors, hey, I'm not a member of the union, what can I do to help? The two answers that come up nearly every single time is, number one, spread the word about the strike, talk about it on social media, and I do that here on the channel. I've covered the writer strike, I've covered the actor strike, I will continue to cover both of these strikes. The other thing that almost everybody recommends is donating, if you're able, to something called the Entertainment Community Fund. And what this is a fund that has been set up to benefit anybody in the entertainment industry, not just actors or writers who are out of work right now, but also carpenters or makeup artists or a key grip. If you're in the entertainment industry and you're in dire financial need, meaning you can't pay your mortgage or your bills or medical expenses, the Entertainment Community Fund is set up to help those people pay bills. And obviously right now, when not just the actors and writers, but all of the associated professions are out of work, this is a vitally important fund to have. So I will not only be sharing the link to the Entertainment Community Fund in the description of every video for the duration of the strike, I will also be donating 5% of my ad revenue, all ad revenue here on the channel, while the strikes are ongoing, to this fund as well. Honestly, I wish it could be more. It's just what I'm able to give at the moment. But I also have to recognize that while I don't consider the work that I do to be promotion, I am still making a living by talking about the entertainment industry, and so many in that industry are experiencing a hardship. So if I can give back a little bit of what I'm making, so I implore you to look into the Entertainment Community Fund if you want to support those on strike and those who are struggling in the industry. And stay tuned here on the channel, because as there is news to cover about the strike, and I hope that there will be very soon, I will be covering it and helping to spread the word right here as well. So let's turn now to the box office for this past weekend, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 we knew was going to be the #1 movie of the summer, but as has been the trend with just about every big summer movie, it came in below expectations. For the 3-day weekend, Dead Reckoning Part 1 brought in $54.6 million for a 5-day total. Remember that it opened back on Wednesday of $78.4 million. It had been anticipated to bring in about $90 million over that 5-day period. The reviews were strong. Audience reaction was strong as well. It has an A cinema score, but even when you look at the estimates from Sunday to Monday, the Sunday estimates were about 1.5 million higher than the actual numbers for Sunday, which is unusual. Usually, if a studio is going to miss on their estimate, they're going to miss low instead of having to take money off of a movie's box office total, but that's not what happened this past weekend. And honestly, if it were a less crowded summer, I would feel a little better about its chances, but it's running into a meat grinder in week 2. And how many times have we seen that this summer? That a movie has a troubled start and then really has its legs cut out from under it because it runs up against immediate competition. In the case of Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, it loses all of its premium screens to Oppenheimer this upcoming weekend. So it does have its work cut out for it. It is not an immediate failure by any stretch of the imagination, but it also needs to do well going forward, and we'll look much more closely at the franchise in just a few minutes. In second place, I mean, this number made my jaw drop, quite frankly, a 38.6% increase in business for Sound of Freedom. It was already in super wide release. It added about 300 theaters this past weekend, but its weekend 2 total is $27.2 million, 38.6% higher than its first weekend, for a total of $85.7 million. This is extraordinarily rare. If you watch the show, you know that movies don't go up in their second weekend. Sometimes we see this on like a holiday weekend where it opens on a weird day before Christmas and then there's a big surge in week 2. But just a regular summer weekend to go up by this much, that is highly unusual, and it goes to show the highly unusual pattern of this movie. And we have a lot more to talk about with Sound of Freedom in just a few minutes. I will say I got some pushback last week by taking on the subject as extensively as I did. And, listen, the easiest thing for me to do, quite frankly, would be just to not talk about it at all. But this is a legitimate news story at both the box office and in the entertainment industry, and I am going to tackle it as completely as I can. So we'll talk more about Sound of Freedom very shortly. In third place is Insidious: The Red Door, taking what I like to call a typical horror movie drop, 60.6% in its second week for a $13 million weekend total, an overall domestic total of $58 million. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is in fourth place, a 55.3% drop in week 3, so good legs are not showing up thus far for Indy here. A $12.2 million total and an overall domestic total of $145.6 million. This movie's had great legs, though. This is almost as jaw-dropping a number as Sound of Freedom. In its fifth week, Elemental drops just 9.3% from last weekend for a total just over $9 million and a domestic total of over $125 million. The overall financial picture for the movie doesn't look great still, but what this does show is that the people that are seeing Elemental are liking the film, they're recommending the film, people are going back to see it again, or perhaps they're catching up on it. It really does seem to me that if Disney had given this movie room to breathe, and by that I mean not throwing it into the middle of the summer movie season, opening up against The Flash and all of this other competition, then it perhaps could have done substantially better at the box office. There's just so much competition this summer that there is no margin for error, and we're seeing movie after movie with disappointing grosses as a result. Dropping out of the top 5 for the first time is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Still a respectable drop though, 24.6% in its 7th weekend for a $6 million total, an overall domestic total at $368.8 million. Transformers Rise of the Beast continues to hang around, 32.6% drop in its 6th week for a $3.4 million total and a domestic total now over $150 million. No Hard Feelings is in 8th place with a $3.2 million total in its 4th weekend in release. Its domestic total is now approaching $50 million. Unfortunately, taking a big drop in weekend 2 is Joyride. That is not what you want to see for the type of comedy that this is, which you hope would thrive on word of mouth. 53.6% drop from its opening weekend and a $2.6 million total, a $10.7 million domestic total. So if this movie is going to catch on, it looks like it's going to be one of those streaming or cult classic type movies. And then still in the top 10, The Little Mermaid. It's been hanging around for 2 months, a 35% drop and a $2.3 million total, almost $2.4 million. And we're seeing if it can get to that $300 million domestic mark. That is another movie that if it had been made just a little bit, or let's be honest, a lot less expensively, it would be a hit movie this summer. It's just that its gross versus what it costs to make is putting it out of that profitability range. Just one movie dropping out of the top 10, Ruby Gillman, Teenage Kraken, only 2 weeks in the top 10. Ruby Gillman is very lucky that there are other big bombs this summer, because we'd be talking about this movie a lot more. By far the least successful film in the history of DreamWorks Animation, so another big studio film struggling at the box office. Looking at what I like to call the road to recovery, the blue line is the weekend average for the years 2015 to 2019. The red line is the weekend average for 2021 and 2022, and then that dotted black line is this year's box office. And you can see that for the first time in a couple of weeks, we are back up over the average at the box office from these last couple of years, although still not close to where we were pre-pandemic. However, if Barbie performs as expected, if Oppenheimer performs as expected, and if Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 holds well, we could see that dotted black line even flirting not just with going above the red line, but with going above that blue line, which is something we've only done a few times already this year. If all three of these movies disappoint this weekend, however, it will be a major blow to the summer box office, because there aren't a whole lot of high-profile films after this big glut coming up this weekend. As you can see, the top performing film for the years 2021 and 2022 was Black Widow. The top performing film for 2015 to 2019 on this weekend was Minions back in the summer of 2015. Looking at the top 5 films internationally, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 opened to $155 million outside of the United States and Canada. The Chinese film Never Say Never is in second place with $45.8 million. In third place is another Chinese film. It's an animated film called 30,000 Miles from Chong'an. This is a film that is rooted in Chinese history and culture. It opened back on July 8th, but as often happens in the Chinese market, is picking up momentum as word spreads. In fourth place is Elemental, which pocketed another $28.2 million internationally, followed by Insidious: The Red Door with $21.5 million. When you take those international grosses, you combine them with our domestic weekend gross, we get the top 5 films worldwide, and they're the same 5 films in the same order. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 opens to a $209.6 million opening 3-day weekend, although keep in mind there was some money that was made on Wednesday and Thursday that's not counted toward this total. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 opened on Wednesday to get those couple of extra days in the premium theaters before Oppenheimer came in and took them all. Whether that was worth the hit they took on the PR side as far as the opening weekend, I'm not really sure. In second place was Never Say Never, and in third place is 30,000 Miles from Chang'an. Those are both strictly Chinese grosses. Elemental is in fourth place with $37.2 million worldwide, and Insidious: The Red Door is in fifth place with $34.5 million worldwide. When we look at the 2023 summer box office race, the top 8 remain the same, with Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse as the highest grossing film of the summer so far. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 is in second place, followed by The Little Mermaid, Transformers: Rise of the Beasts, and Fast X. It has now ended its domestic run, and we're going to take a deeper look at that movie's finances later on. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny will take that 5th spot very soon, and probably also that 4th spot. Elemental is in 7th place with The Flash right behind. Look at that, though. Sound of Freedom. If there was anybody that had Sound of Freedom as even a contender for their summer box office top 10, I need to meet them, because they are a true prognosticator. It enters the charts at number 9. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 enters the chart at number 10. The Boogeyman and No Hard Feelings both dropping out of the 2023 summer box office. And looking at my predictions, again, this upcoming week is a big one for me, because my final 2 films that I picked as top 10 summer films both open, which are Oppenheimer and Barbie. And then all of my films will be in play. However, it's also very likely that one of those films is going to knock The Flash out of the summer top 10, which means that I will have officially missed my first pick, because I picked The Flash as the 4th highest grossing film of the summer. Man, things looked a lot different back in late April, early May. All the rest of my films, though, are still in the top 10, at least for now. Currently, I only have 2 movies that I picked in the correct placements: Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny and Elemental, although both of those movies may soon abandon those positions to move to other positions on the summer movie chart. Looking at the race for the #1 movie of the summer, again, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse continues to increase its lead over Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. The Little Mermaid, as you can see, really flattened out. And then look at Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. I thought it could be a contender. Now, it starts much lower on this chart. It's there in yellow because it opened on a Wednesday, which had a much lower weekday gross than if you open on a Friday. And it's got a bit of a steeper curve than those other films, but it's really going to have to hold strong to even have a chance at being the #1 movie of the summer. Quite honestly, I don't think that it's going to happen with the competition that it's facing, but I will continue to track it, as well as probably Barbie this upcoming weekend, as the race for the #1 movie of the summer continues to heat up into July and August. So let's talk about some of the movies in the top 10 individually, and we'll start with Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. It's one of the longest titles. So many long titles this summer. It was the 5th best 3-day opening weekend worldwide of any film this year thus far at $209.6 million. Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, Fast X, and the Super Mario Bros. Movie all opened higher. One place that Mission Impossible is not playing as well in, as has been the case with just about every other movie, is China. It's really becoming crystal clear that Hollywood's dependence on China as a major contributor, or at least a reliable major contributor to box office grosses, is coming to an end, because it's clear that Chinese audiences are not showing up for American films in anywhere close to the numbers that we saw prior to the pandemic, and it's largely because there's been a shift to a focus on Chinese films in the Chinese market. There are some breakout hits there still. Fast X did well in the market. Avatar did well in the market. But you cannot rely on them to go see as many blockbusters as you used to, even with a big star like Tom Cruise. Let's look at the franchise tracker for Mission Impossible, and it's a very strange franchise because the majority of the films, 4 out of 7, actually all opened on a Wednesday. So this is through 5 days in release domestically, 5 days in wide release. And right now, unadjusted for inflation, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 put up the best 5-day opening of any film in the Mission Impossible franchise, topping the opening of Mission Impossible 2 back in 2000 by about $300,000. Mission Impossible 2 also opened on a Wednesday. Mission Impossible Fallout, though, is right behind at $77.5 million. That was a Friday through Tuesday run, followed by Mission Impossible Rogue Nation, the first Mission Impossible film, which also opened on a Wednesday. Then Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, which opened on a Wednesday, but its total also includes a 5-day IMAX limited run before it opened in wide release. So all kinds of asterisks there on that film. And then Mission Impossible 3 in 7th place. But when we talk about the importance of adjusting for inflation, especially with a franchise that's been around as long as Mission Impossible has, when you do adjust those figures for inflation, Dead Reckoning Part 1 goes from the best 5-day opening in franchise history to the worst. The best opening adjusted for inflation is Mission Impossible 2 back in the year 2000 at $138.5 million, followed by the first Mission Impossible in 1996 at $123.5 million. Then Mission Impossible Fallout at $94.1 million, Rogue Nation in 4th place, Ghost Protocol in 5th place, and Mission Impossible 3 in 6th place. And there we have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. So yes, the record books are going to reflect one thing, but the reality is that as far as the first 5 days go, Dead Reckoning Part 1 is one of the weaker, if not the weakest film in the series when it comes to domestic gross. Looking at the final domestic gross, and this is basically to establish a baseline for these movies, Dead Reckoning Part 1, of course, because it's only been out a few days, is in last place with $78.4 million. It should have no problem passing the domestic gross of Mission Impossible 3, but then it's got its work cut out for it. Mission Impossible back in 1996 made $180.9 million. Rogue Nation made $195 million. Ghost Protocol made $209.3 million. Mission Impossible 2 made $215.4 million, and then Mission Impossible Fallout made $220.1 million. So these are not insurmountable numbers, and it's always surprising to me how relatively low the grosses are for this franchise, given the fact that it stars Tom Cruise and how many installments there have been. The top grossing film in the Mission Impossible franchise is just at $220.1 million, and that may be another indication that perhaps people were giving this film a little bit too much credit, perhaps hyping it up a little too much, tying it to Top Gun Maverick a little bit too much. Things look a little better when you adjust the movies for inflation. The top grossing film adjusted for inflation is Mission Impossible 2. Yes, the movie that almost everybody agrees is the worst film in the franchise is also the highest grossing film in the franchise at $381.6 million adjusted for inflation domestically, followed by the first Mission Impossible at just over $350 million. Then Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol at $284 million, Mission Impossible Fallout at $267.5 million, Rogue Nation at $251 million, and Mission Impossible 3 at $202 million. And there we have Dead Reckoning Part 1 at $78.4 million. And then finally, looking at the movies by worldwide gross, $399.3 million is the number to beat if Dead Reckoning Part 1 wants to be the sixth highest grossing Mission Impossible film of all time. The original made $457.6 million back in 1996. Then we get up over the $500 million mark with Mission Impossible 2 at $549 million, Rogue Nation at $688.8 million, Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol at $694.7 million, and then the highest grossing worldwide Mission Impossible film is Mission Impossible Fallout, the last film back in 2018. It made $786.6 million, which is right about where this movie needs to be to break even. Because again, in addition to the somewhat disappointing or perhaps a little bit lackluster debut of the film domestically, this is also a movie with a huge budget, largely inflated by COVID, as so many other budgets have been. But this huge budget necessitates that it do incredibly well worldwide and or domestically, especially when you look at it in comparison to the other films in this franchise. These are my estimates for theatrical profits so far. Now, keep in mind, again, these are theatrical grosses only, and Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is actually in a pretty good position as far as profitability in the sense that it has a lot of promotional partners. A lot of products are tied to this film, which means they brought in a lot of money that way, and this will probably be a film that's popular on digital rentals and physical media, etc. So I think that it's likely that this movie does break even, but will it be able to do so in the theatrical window? Well, so far it's made about $25.7 million from China, certainly better than a lot of other films this year. That brings in $5.7 million back to the investors, $129.3 million from the rest of the world for a $51.7 million investor cut. And then 60% of its opening weekend gross comes in at about $47 million. The budget for the film is reported at $291 million. Yes, that's right, $291 million. I put prints and advertising at $109 million to kind of round out that cost to an even $400 million. And also because if you have seen the lavish spending that they did for this film, the big premieres, all of the advertisements, I think it's likely that the marketing budget for this film is well over even $109 million. So I'm putting estimated costs, and if I get actual numbers later, I will update this, at $400 million. The movie's made $233.4 million through its first weekend worldwide. That's netted at $104.5 million by my estimates, which means that the movie needs another $295.4 million in order to turn a profit in the theatrical window, which I think translates to a worldwide gross around $750, $800 million. That is not, frankly, impossible for the movie, but again, it's going to have to hold up really, really well, and there is a lot of competition in the marketplace. We did a big breakdown of Sound of Freedom last week, but I feel like we have to discuss it just a little bit because this is now the breakout hit of the summer. Now at $85 million, it looks like it is a lock to have a $100 million plus final domestic gross. And I got, as I mentioned, a lot of pushback last week about the movie, saying that, it was a conspiracy theory movie and people were upset that I even gave it any kind of a platform. And I pushed back then, and I continue to push back a little bit. I don't regret the fact that I tried to last week sort of delineate the movie itself from the people and the conversation surrounding it. Now, yes, this movie is being used and championed by people who push really, I think, harmful and destructive and untrue, provably untrue conspiracy theories. And by the way, that includes the star of the movie. And I understand the hesitance that many people have when it comes to talking about this, and I don't defend the views of the people associated with this film, although again, I think that it is a well-made film on its own in a vacuum. But this is undeniably one of the biggest breakout surprise hits of the last several years, and it would be an oversight to not talk about it, at least from a news standpoint, because this movie also has a very interesting financial model. We talked last week about the pay-it-forward system that Angel Studios has in place, where people can basically gift a ticket for someone else to claim for free to watch the film. Now, we don't know exactly how much of this pay-it-forward money has been applied to the film's theatrical gross. Last week, when the movie reported grosses for July 4th, the day that it was reported to have beaten Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny at the box office, they did include the money from pay-it-forward ticket purchases as part of the box office gross, but that obviously is not the norm when it comes to reporting grosses for this movie, and mathematics kind of tells us why. Because as of right now, according to the Angel Studios website, nearly 8 million tickets are listed as having been purchased to pay forward to other people. That just means that people paid Angel Studios $15, and then Angel Studios uses that money to buy a ticket for somebody else. But $15 times the number of tickets sold comes out to around $120 million, which is much higher than the movie's box office gross. So it's obvious that they are not reporting all pay-it-forward ticket sales as tickets sold for the movie. And so the question now remains, how much of that domestic gross is pay-it-forward ticket sales? Did they just report it for that one day? And if they did, I think that the box office grosses should be adjusted to only count actual tickets bought at the box office. Nobody really has chased down an answer to this question. I'm going to try in the next couple of weeks. But I think for me, this is what's really important, is that when we look at the domestic gross of this film, it's not how many tickets have been pledged to have been bought, how many tickets have actually been bought for this movie. It is ironic, or whatever you want to call it, that there are also conspiracy theories that have sprung up around this movie that the theaters are empty and nobody's really buying tickets to see this film, which is actually the argument that was made in many cases from the opposite side of the ideological spectrum about Captain Marvel several years ago. The same exact thing. I pushed back heavily against those theories several years ago when it came up, and I also push back against those theories here. Just because you don't want a movie to succeed doesn't mean that you can just make up stories about that movie. And absent some kind of proof, actual proof, that there are actually completely quote-unquote sold-out theaters that are empty for Sound of Freedom, then I can't give those theories any more credence than I did the Captain Marvel theories all those years ago. I mentioned Elemental a little bit before. It is moving up the charts, although it's still the bottom of the Pixar charts, but it has now officially passed the domestic gross of The Good Dinosaur, something I really didn't give it much hope of doing a few weeks ago, at $125.6 million. I don't think it's going to get past Cars 3 at $152.9 million, but still, for it to get to this point is somewhat impressive, even though it is going to still be a big loss in the theatrical window. Looking at the franchise tracker for Pixar adjusted for inflation, Elemental has passed both Onward and Lightyear, but it is still a good deal behind 2015's The Good Dinosaur. So yes, it is nice that Elemental's hung around like it has, but that doesn't really lessen its financial burdens. Speaking of financial burdens, Fast X has officially ended its domestic release, and its money-making has really dwindled everywhere else around the world. So it's a good time to kind of do a final report on the finances for Fast X. It had a decent worldwide gross, but the problem is, due to COVID, due to losing a director, and due to just franchise bloat, this was a heinously expensive movie. So let's look at the final financial report for Fast X. It actually did well in China, one of the few Hollywood films to do that this year. It brought in $145.8 million. 22.5% of that roughly means $32.8 million goes back to investors. Another $431.9 million from other international markets. I've got $172.7 million of that coming back to investors. Then $84.9 million from its first week domestically, $34.2 million from its second week, and just just $26.7 million from the remainder of its domestic run. So the most lucrative market, the domestic one, the film really ran out of gas quickly. The budget for Fast X again reported at $340 million, with at least $100 million in advertising costs. That means that the movie costs $440 million total, with a $723.6 million worldwide gross that netted $288.7 million. That means that theatrically, Fast X, by my calculations, came up about $150 million shy of turning a profit. I think that the movie itself will eventually become profitable because of all of the tie-ins, because of digital rentals and sales, but I don't think it's going to be an extremely profitable movie, which for a movie of its size, for a movie that's supposed to be kicking off the last part of the Fast franchise, and with Universal committed as of right now to doing at least 2 more of these, the Hobbs spinoff with The Rock, and then Fast 11, and then maybe another Fast movie after that. I'm not quite sure if there's 2 or 3 movies left. This is not what they want to see. They don't want to just be eking out a profit on ancillaries. They want to be making a lot of money. Fast X, not a huge moneymaker, and actually a money loser when you look at just tickets sold around the world. We've got a lot more box office to break down, but before we do, I want to thank the sponsors for this week's show. Today's show is brought to you by AG1, a daily nutritional supplement that supports whole body health. We are in the middle of summer, and it's the perfect time to take care of all those summer activities. Have fun with friends, hit the pool, whatever you like to do. And it's also a great time to make sure that your body is firing on all cylinders. I drink AG1 every morning, and it makes me feel like I'm covering my bases no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm traveling, I'm staying at home, I'm shooting a video, I have the rare day off. It's important for me to keep things on track regardless when it comes to my immune system, gut health, and so much more. I've struggled in the past, as many people do, with keeping a routine, but drinking AG1 is as simple as, well, drinking a glass of water in the morning. It's just 1 scoop of powder mixed with water once a day, and that's it. Each scoop is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. I also have some AG1 travel packs, so if I'm hitting the road like I am this morning, then I never have to miss a day, even when I'm on the go. If you want to take ownership of your health, try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to drinkag1.com/Dan. That's drinkag1.com/Dan. Check it out. Let's take a look now at the per theater averages for this past weekend. And at number 1 was one of my favorite movies out of the Sundance Film Festival this year. I actually thought it was going to be in a much wider release this past weekend, but it was only in 6 theaters, and that is Theater Camp. It made $50,000 per theater in those 6 theaters, which is a great number, and we'll see how it stacks up against the other per theater averages this year in just a second. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 is in second place. It brought in $12,639 per theater in each of its 4,327 theaters. A Fire, the Silver Bear Award-winning film that we mentioned last week, brought in $9,621 per theater in just 4 theaters. Sound of Freedom bringing in $8,552, we think. It added around 300 theaters in weekend 2, as I mentioned earlier. And then the documentary Lakota Nation versus United States in just 1 theater comes in 5th place, bringing in $8,552. And as I mentioned, Theater Camp, one of the best per theater averages of the year so far. Asteroid City still putting up the best of the year at $140,000 in 6 theaters last month. Then Beau is Afraid at $80,000 in 4 theaters back in April. Past Lives put up an average of $58,000 in 4 theaters back in June. And then we have Theater Camp in 4th place, $50,203 in 6 theaters, leaving the Super Mario Bros. Movie as the only wide release film currently with one of the best per theater averages of the year at $33,701 in each of its 4,343 theaters back in April. Looking at the films this past weekend in limited release, meaning 1,000 theaters or fewer, at number 1 is The Miracle Club, a star-studded film with Laura Linney, Kathy Bates, Maggie Smith, and more. It made $664,000 in 678 theaters. Past Lives continues to wind down its theatrical release, but it's still playing in 386 theaters around the country, and it brought in $537,882. Maviran, which is a Tamil language Indian film about a man who hears a voice in his head that can predict the future, is in third place. I don't know how many theaters it was in exactly, but it brought in $311,000 total. Then Theater Camp with its $301,000 total in 6 theaters, and the Chinese film Lost in the Stars, again in an unknown number of theaters, bringing in $263,000 total. Of course, so many of these films are to be found in the independent theaters that are around this country, and as I've been doing for the past several weeks, I'm going to take a moment to spotlight one in particular, and then a slice of the advertising revenue from this specific video will go to that theater. And this week we are talking about a very special theater because it's not just a theater, it's also operated by a really good organization. The theater is called the Alamo Theater in Bucksport, Maine, a town of around 5,000. Built in 1916, the Alamo was originally meant for both film and live theatrical performances, and it operated as a movie theater until 1956 before several other businesses occupied the space. Back in 1992, a then fledgling organization called Northeast Historic Film, which is devoted to the preservation of film media and history in the northeastern United States, bought the vacant space and with the help of the town of Bucksport, slowly began the process of renovating the Alamo Theater. The new Alamo Theater started projecting film in 35mm in May of 1999, and the space currently shows a mixture of films along with hosting community events. This week, the theater is hosting a screening of Upcountry from a local Maine filmmaker, as well as Asteroid City this weekend. And then on Saturday afternoon, I think this is so cool, the town of Bucksport is sponsoring a free screening of the Super Mario Bros. Movie to anybody in the public who wants to show up. Now, in addition to operating the Alamo, Northeast Historic Film also offers digitization and transfer services for VHS, 16mm, and 8mm film, and they also offer vault storage in order for people to preserve film, and this is all in support of their cause, which is to catalog and preserve the history of northern New England through moving images. You can find out more about the work of Northeast Historic Film, as well as buy tickets for the Alamo and make a charitable donation at oldfilm.org, and if you do any of those things, as always, please be sure to tell them that Dan sent you. Let's take a look now at some 2023 charts, and we will start with the domestic chart for this year. Nothing's really changed since last week. The Super Mario Bros. Movie is still number 1, and then about $200 million behind it is Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, followed closely by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. The Little Mermaid is still at number 4, Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania is at number 5, John Wick Chapter 4 is at number 6, Creed 3 is at number 7, Transformers Rise of the Beast is at number 8, Fast X looks to be locked in for now at number 9. However, it will be passed probably today by Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and then if it performs as expected, Barbie soon after. Right now, though, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny rounds out the top 10. And when we look at the top 10 films for the worldwide box office this year, the Super Mario Bros. Movie, again, easily number 1 at $1.34 billion, followed by Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, trying to get to that $850 million mark. It's right now at $838.9 million. Fast X is the third highest grossing film of the year worldwide at $723.6 million. It just costs so damn much. Full River Red's at number 4. Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse is at number 5. The Wandering Earth is at number 6. The Little Mermaid's at number 7. Lost in the Stars is on the cusp of breaking that $500 million mark. It moves past Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania for number 8. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania moves down to number 9. And John Wick Chapter 4, for the moment, is at number 10. Before we wrap things up, as always, I like to take a look at a weekend in box office history, and we're going back to the 28th weekend of 2003. Believe it or not, it has been 20 years since we were introduced to Captain Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, the movie that revived Johnny Depp's career. One of the surprise hits of that summer. I don't think anybody really expected much out of that movie. $46.6 million on its opening 3-day weekend. It had already opened a couple days earlier, so it had a total of $70.7 million at the end of that first weekend. In second place, the movie that was so bad it drove Sean Connery to retirement, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which opened in a distant second place at $23 million. At number 3 is Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines, which I think gets a little bit of a bad rap. It's not a terrible film, but it should have absolutely been the last Terminator film. It dropped off 55.8% in its second week with a $19.4 million weekend two and a domestic total of $110.3 million. Legally Blonde 2, Red, White, and Blonde in its second week dropped off 45.9% for a $12 million weekend and a domestic total of $62.8 million. And then in fifth place, Finding Nemo, in its seventh week of release, a 23.5% drop and an $8.4 million total with a domestic running total of $291 million. Man, Pixar would like some of that money this summer. Now, as we always do, I don't like to just leave these numbers where they are. I like to see what they would look like if you translated them into today's numbers, which is why we're going to hit that inflation button and see that Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl opened to an equivalent of $77.3 million in its first three-day weekend for a domestic total of $117.2 million. The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen opening to $38.2 million in second place adjusted for inflation, followed by Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines at $32.2 million and a domestic total of $182.9 million. Legally Blonde 2 in fourth place with a $19.9 million adjusted second weekend and a domestic total of $104.2 million. And then Finding Nemo in its seventh week, a $14 million weekend and an adjusted total of $482.6 million. You see there, adjusted for inflation, that all five films are at $14 million or higher. That hasn't happened since last year at the domestic box office. It was the weekend that The Black Phone and Elvis opened the same weekend, while Jurassic World Dominion, Lightyear, and Top Gun Maverick were all continuing their box office runs. As we wrap up, I have been doing something the last few weeks that I call Rotten Tomatoes Decoded, where I look at how critics are rating movies on the tomato meter, which is a binary indicator of only good or bad when it comes to reviews, and how those reviews can change when you look at it by the average critic score, which is a 1 out of 10 score that can add a little bit of nuance and maybe help to guide you a bit better as you're trying to decide what movie you want to see. So let's look first at some new and upcoming releases when you look at the tomato meter. Now, unfortunately, Barbie and Oppenheimer have not had reviews published yet, so they're not on this chart. So these are mostly films that are in theaters currently and a few on streaming. These are their fresh Rotten Tomato meter scores. Netflix's The Outlaws is in the basement at 22%, Insidious The Red Door at 37%, and then Bird Box Barcelona also on Netflix at 44%. Then kind of hanging around the same area, we've got Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny at 68% fresh, Sound of Freedom at 72% fresh, and Elemental at 74% fresh. A little bit of a jump up, and then we have Theater Camp at 81% fresh. And then keep in mind the difference in these percentages. We have Joyride at 92% fresh, then Across the Spider-Verse at 96%. They Cloned Tyrone, which is hitting Netflix this weekend, at 96% fresh. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 at 96% fresh. And then Past Lives at 98% fresh. So if you're looking at those top five options, it's a little tough to parse which one maybe the critics liked most of all. Well, that's why you bring in that average critical rating. And when we look at the chart by critical rating on average, it becomes a little more clear. The Outlaws and Insidious The Red Door and Bird Box Barcelona are all still rotten, although a little bit better when you look at average score than their ratings would suggest. Indiana Jones and Elemental right now are tied, both with a 6.4 average out of 10 from critics. Sound of Freedom is ahead of them at 6.7, but then look at Theater Camp, Joyride, and They Clone Tyrone. Theater Camp's at 81% fresh, Joyride is at 92% fresh, and They Clone Tyrone is at 96% fresh, and yet they have nearly identical average ratings, which to me says, and this happened with Joyride last week, now also with They Cloned Tyrone, that critics are either going, when it comes to the fresh rotten rating, a little easier on Joyride and They Cloned Tyrone, or a little harder on Theater Camp, because there's a big disparity when you look at the tomato meter rating, the fresh rotten rating, between Theater Camp and They Clone Tyrone. 15 percentage points, 81% to 96%, and yet Theater Camp has an average rating of 7.2, and They Clone Tyrone has an average rating of 7.5, which is roughly equivalent. So that's something that's very interesting to note. Then we have Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning at an 8.0 average critical rating, Across the Spider-Verse at 8.6, and then, as we've been saying, Past Lives, easily the top-rated critical film right now at a 9.1 average critic rating out of 10. Let's wrap up by taking a look at some movies that are hitting theaters this week, and we'll start with the much-hyped Barbenheimer weekend. We thought that this would never happen, that one of these movies would move, but neither of them have. Barbie opens this weekend in wide release. I will have my review for the film out tomorrow morning. Oppenheimer opens also on Friday in wide release. I will have my review out probably on Thursday evening or Friday morning. And then in limited release, a few different options. There's Return to Dust, a Chinese film about a middle-aged couple in an arranged marriage. Also, Fear the Night from writer-director Neil LaBute, a home invasion thriller starring Maggie Q. Cobweb is also hitting limited release. It's a horror mystery starring Woody Norman, who I loved in Come On, Come On, Lizzie Kaplan, and Anthony Starr, who I love in The Boys. And then finally, another horror mystery film called Mother May I is hitting limited release. It's about a man experiencing strange visions in his late mother's house. All of those movies and more will be available in theaters this weekend. Thank you so much for spending some of your time listening to me yammer on about box office figures. Please do check the description below for more information about the Entertainment Community Fund if you want to help those who are being hurt by the strikes that are happening right now, and also for information about AG1, our sponsor for this week's show. And stay tuned right here. As I mentioned, it's going to be a busy week with reviews for movies as well as spoiler reviews, news, streaming charts, everything else that might come up. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you then. Bye.